What I will talk about today is very much an applied example of the value of culture, the value of politics, and how those two come together within the organisation of the Victoria and Albert Museum where I work. It's a programme that's been in place for about 5 years, and again, I would invite you to judge its success. I mean, it's lasted 5 years, which is an achievement, and it's made a certain amount of headlines and impact, but I don't want to say, one, that we've reinvented the wheel at the museum, or two, that our activities are so brilliant that they have no comparison or predecessor. So I am a curator of product and digital design at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And clearly, I'm here to talk about the political role of cultural institutions, and those two might seem slightly at odds. If I'm interested in mobile phones, gadgets, why do I come to the subject of politics in museums? Well, the answer is a programme of collecting that has been introduced into a new department at the V&A in the last 5 years. I work on it collaboratively, both with my colleagues, but also with our audiences. And the talk will be in 3 parts. First, I will introduce what rapid response collecting is, then something of its context and reaction, but then, much more importantly, it comes to a conversation and a discussion and perhaps some of the ideas of what's next. So, as part of rapid response collecting, the V&A has brought into its permanent collection, so these objects stand in equal value to every other object in our collection. We have acquired a set of Christian Louboutin high-heeled shoes in 5 ethnically diverse shades of nude. The term nude in the English language describes Caucasian skin. It is not actually a colour, and Louboutin was throwing this into question. We have a Motorola wearable computer, which changes our understanding of the nature of work today. This computational system makes possible our online shopping. What are our choices meaning and impacting on our wider world? We have Mon Mon. He's here because he's cute. He's a WeChat-enabled soft toy. So WeChat is the Chinese equivalent and bigger and better version of WhatsApp, and this is a product marketed to young families where parents are living away from their children. The social media enables you to communicate. Here we have a Lego set. It's the first in the 82-year history of the company to feature women in a non-gendered professional setting. Imagine that. We have an astronomer, a paleontologist, and a chemist. They are women, and proudly so. We have a hand-painted umbrella, which we collected in September 2017, immediately after the democratic protests and uprising in Hong Kong. This object could not feel more timely still today. We have a Pussy Power hat. I'm imagining some of you might have worn one of these at some point since 2017. This one was worn on the Women's Day March in Washington, D.C. in 2017. For those of you unfamiliar with the object, it is a craft protest response to Donald Trump's idea of grabbing a woman by the pussy. Again, an object that's been in the collection for a number of years, but could not be more current. It's a Vote Leave campaign leaflet, which used the graphic identity of our National Health Service to mislead. It used a graphic identity to advocate for the UK to leave the European Union. These were freely distributed in our hospitals, not necessarily by the usual channels. We also have a fashion branding campaign from the British high street shop Jigsaw. It addressed the subject of immigration head-on, again, in a post-EU referendum climate in the UK. We have a slogan T-shirt that caught the attention in our most recent general election. There will soon be another, where a digital meme, here we have Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, restyled as a Nike T-shirt, but it was an object that spoke to an energized youth vote, the youth vote that is on social media and wouldn't consider themselves necessarily to be indifferent or irrelevant. We have camera-enabled sunglasses, which in their failure, like Google Glass, these Snapchat spectacles failed in the market. And that failure can be understood as a discomfort with ubiquitous computing. The voyeuristic eye is not yet, as enabled by technology, is not yet something that we are comfortable with. These objects could both be understood as a failure or something of the future yet to come. And then a favorite of mine, we have recently acquired an emoji which is intended to cross language barriers. The mosquito is one of the deadliest animals in the world, and in public health, an emoji that tells you about the threat of Zika or other viruses is hugely important. We also have a menstrual cup, which was launched onto the market at the time of a greater concern for the planet, so last year. Menstruation is not a subject that you find in many museums. And our most recent acquisition, which is, again, the design identity of the climate activist group Extinction Rebellion. They are currently protesting or rebelling in their terms across the globe. So those are a series of objects that we've acquired under rapid response collecting. And a very reasonable question might be, what do these disparate and modest objects have in common? What do they say about contemporary design? Or indeed, why in a museum? And why in particular in the Victoria and Albert Museum? How many of you know the V&A, just to give me a sense of context? Brilliant. I feel honoured. So yes, this is the Victoria and Albert Museum as seen from above. And we are a very large museum and best known for our grand galleries and very rich collections of decorative and fine arts. Our other big ticket attraction are our blockbuster exhibitions. This was the Christian Dior exhibition that closed earlier this year. We attracted 600,000 visitors. So that's the context of the V&A. Those are the objects I have brought into the collection. It's quite surprising, unusual. Well, what and how has that been possible? And what is the purpose? What's the motivation? Is it a reasonable thing to do? Of course, we are a public organisation. I'm a public servant, and I hold and collect objects in public trust. So, behind these elite objects, the glitz and glamour, there is a radical past within the museum. And you really cannot see this, so you will have to trust me, but this is the pediment above the museum's original entrance, and it encapsulates our founding moment. So, the UK, as history tells, was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and by the 1850s, we were being outdone in terms of our industrial output, our industrial design. The French, the Germans, you name it, the nations of the world were as competitive as we were. And so the Great Exhibition, the first Great Exhibition was hosted in 1851, and we invited the nations to come, and Queen Victoria, the largest figure in the middle, is standing in front of the black outline, is the Crystal Palace, receiving the nations of the world, who brought with them the best science, design, industry, and art. We were all to learn collectively from each other, but in particular, Great Britain was to benefit and learn. The Great Exhibition was a vast success, and the Victoria and Albert Museum and the museums in Albertopolis, so the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, all of these museums were to make permanent this success. We are the profit of this great exhibition. And the V&A's purpose in particular was to collect contemporary and historic design as an educational resource for manufacturers, designers, and the public. And within this context, the V&A was the first to have lighting so that you could go after work. We had a cafe so that you could eat before you learned. The best circumstance for learning is not on an empty stomach. But it was very much about enabling the every person to come to the museum to learn and improve their own lot. In effect, you can understand the V&A as a museum that was to serve as a means to help navigate what was then the new realities of the industrial age. Fast forward a few years to today, and the museum has 4 million visitors a year. And we have a new exhibition road entrance designed by Amanda Levitt, the architect that you'll be familiar with here in Lisbon from Março. And we need to be a museum of the 21st century. And of course, that is a subject of considerable debate. But to my mind, in a global, data-enabled, smartphone-powered world, we are there to help navigate the realities of the digital age. What is it to collect today? And what are we doing in order to help inform our publics in the here and now, but also the choices we all make for the future? So this is what a grand ambition, I appreciate that, and that's where rapid response collecting comes in. We, as a group of curators, have set about trying to recover this radical purpose, that sense of needing to do, to be a public place of information. I couch this conversation within the context of design. I'm a design curator, that's where my expertise sits. But it's to think about, in the context of today's conference, how the activity of rapid response collecting and what we have learnt might be translated to a wider conversation across the sector. But what rapid response does, this is the gallery. I'm going to tell you it's a very modest space. We have 5 showcases and 12 objects on display at any one time. The museum has 10 kilometres of galleries, so it is a pinpoint in the wider organisation. But what rapid response does is create a framework through which we can bring objects into the museum and put them on immediate display when they are still the subject of public and critical discourse. It is about getting them into the museum quickly and on display so that conversations can begin. It's about the capacity to deepen understanding of an issue by showing the thing itself. So we opened to the public in 2014, and we have now, I think I may have mentioned already, about 30 objects on display in the collection and 12 on display at any one time. We are a big organisation, but the display is designed to be very straightforward. The labels are magnetic. I print them on my desktop printer. It's as rudimentary as that, and that's very much with intent, because I think some of the reasons that museums can be seen to be sclerotic or slow is about bureaucracy and procedure. So this is not only a curatorial practice, but it's a practical or pragmatic approach to what it means to collect. We have to go through the same process of acquisition as any other object in the museum. So we don't shortcut what it means to collect, but we shortcut some of the processes that take a long period of time. So it's as much, therefore, also a place to test and develop ideas. And for me, the most important part of that is to test and develop them in public with our public. There are 2 objects that we've acquired, which are those that around which our thinking crystallized and that keep reminding us of our intent and purpose. This here is a modest object. It's a pair of Primark jeans. I'm not quite sure if Primark is a shop that you have here in Portugal. Yes, so you will know Primark is inexpensive, fast fashion. But it's an object of the Portuguese, but also the British high street. And we acquired this object in the weeks immediately after the most major disaster in the garment industry. On the 24th of April 2013, the Rana Plaza factory building collapsed in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and more than 1,100 garment workers lost their lives. So this is an object that connects the national collection of fashion and textiles to the realities of what fast fashion is. To us, that was important. And again, forgive the small image, but here you can see, it's a different pair of trousers on display, but also they are shown next to the photographs of the collapsed factory. I consider my work in rapid response to be something of an investigative curator. So we saw these trousers and the headlines of objects or European fashion houses in the rubble in Dakar, and we went and bought a pair of jeans exactly like we saw in the photograph. We, of course, then reached out to Primark to ask if this object was indeed made in that factory. And at the time, they said, we cannot confirm this, and that's it. Which for us was a challenge, but it was not, given that also we hadn't yet made firm the program. It was a challenge that we were going to rise to. And we went to all the activist groups, those on the ground, to understand whether we actually had an object with true provenance. It was only when we press released the Rapid Response Collecting program and had the picture of this pair of trousers that Primark got back in touch and said they had been made in Pakistan. But we had then the opportunity to work with the company to understand how they had reacted to this immense disaster and what their corporate social responsibility policies were, but also to source a pair of jeans that we do now hold in the collection that was made in Dakar. So again, it's about how these contemporary objects bring us into contact with those who have suffered, but also how big business or fast fashion reacts and deals with. So it's insights, knowledge, and expertise that we can bring into the museum through these types of objects. The second of the two first or early examples of our acquisitions program is a 3D printed firearm. It's known as the Liberator and was designed by Cody Wilson, who was a law student at the time, but considered himself to be, and still does, a crypto-anarchist. So what we hold in the museum is the digital file, because it is the digital opportunity of 3D printing that makes this gun powerful. It's not its capability as a firearm, because actually it's quite dangerous to use, but it's more that it's an object that is undetectable. It goes about the law. It's unregulated. This changes our understanding of the power of digital production, but also how the social norms and expectations, the framework of the law shapes, our shared and collective reality. So what did we do after we'd seen this gun on the television? We went to see Cody Wilson in his studio in Texas and persuaded him to allow us to collect the gun. That wasn't as straightforward as one might imagine, because actually we could purchase the gun from him. The V&A has a firearms license. Again, we are a national collection. He has an export license, but there is nowhere in the framework of the American or British law that says a gun can be made of plastic. So it actually took a year for the gun to come into the collection because the law had to be changed. And again, this pattern or this story, this context of acquisition is a rich source of understanding of our contemporary circumstance. But it's also to say that Rapid Response Collecting has an ambition to speak about contemporary design practice in the round. Design museums are so often about the excellent, the beautiful, the luxurious. My interest is in a rounded contemporary history. So it goes from the sinister to the beautiful, because that is the world in which we live, and I feel committed to telling those stories within the institution. I'm going to skip the video. And so here you can see that gun. Oops, now we've gone too fast. In the museum, it's the first fired example. It broke within 3 firings. Again, this is an important part of its narrative. The museum has that opportunity to recognize that it's a brilliant piece of design engineering, but brilliance in one arena does not mean success in all. But it enables us to discuss some of the challenges that were signaled also this morning about what new technology means, the role it plays in our lives, and how the framework of the law can keep up with a changing digital landscape, and what that means in terms of regulation, which can no longer be state-bound. So the jeans and the gun are exemplary of what Rapid Response seeks to do, because these objects are material evidence of social, political, technological, and economic change. They are newsworthy precisely because they advance what design can do, or because they reveal truths about how we live together today. We seek to focus difficult to grasp questions around material things, and they place our relationship to these objects into a different context. Response is about saying design is a lens through which to understand the world. And from a curatorial practice point of view, it's about doing everything in public. The team has a conversation. So I sit in a department of 15. 5 of us are curators. We talk, we discuss, we think about what those objects are. But in some ways, it's about looking out to the world to understand which objects of design bring or enable us to ask these questions that address the human condition in the 21st century. When we put these objects on display, here you can just about see the boxes of text. Our texts are slightly longer than you might understand to be good practice in the museum, but each and every one of them says why we have acquired the object at a given point in time, and it invites the visitor to take their own view. The other thing that we do with rapid response collecting is to say, suggest objects to us. It's a public conversation, and if we want to have a public conversation, we need to be able to listen as well as to speak. And so anybody can suggest an object, so that reaches across the 120 curators that we are at the V&A. We are quite a few, through to any one of our members of the public, or indeed, if any of you are so inspired, please do suggest an object. Federico has done so previously. So the other, just while I have the display here, the thing that Rapid Response has brought to me, it's the first time in my work in the museum where I've been asked whether my object labels, so the text that we put on public display, has been reviewed by a lawyer. And that's an interesting question to me, because we have to be factually accurate, absolutely yes, but it's about saying what is the role of the museum and what does it mean to collect. Some of those who we've approached to acquire, so their interest or their type of interest has changed once they've understood the context within which we are working. That was a particular challenge when we first started the program. It's become a lot less as we've become established, and it's a recognized platform for conversation. I think many, when first approached and weren't quite clear what a museum might be doing in this more critical avenue, was, are you pointing fingers? Are you saying our design is bad? You know, it was this anxiety about what the practice or the program was there to do. I think it very unlikely, well, we have to make sure that we are rigorous, authoritative, and truthful, but I want to be absolutely certain also that we are not taken to court. And that's an interesting perspective for a curator. I don't think it's a current challenge, but it was one that I felt acutely at the beginning. So just to move now to the reception. And again, in some instances, I'm going to read out the headlines because I appreciate that some of you at the rear can't see. But since opening the display, the responses range from the indifferent. So here we have the independent. Why all the fuss about the V&A's 3D printed gun? It's a symbol, not a threat. To the surprise objects finding a home at the V&A in the Financial Times. Here we have the Telegraph very recently reporting on our acquisition of Extinction Rebellion. And to quote, the V&A's interest in Extinction Rebellion is peculiar. It gets a huge amount of taxpayers' money and should understand that people need to go about their daily business. That's part of a very strongly minded article. And then to the outrage. This was when Trump first came to visit the UK, and it was suggested that the V&A should acquire the Trump balloon. Here we have an opinion piece in Design, which is a very widely read online design magazine. The headline reads, "Museums need to focus less on collecting headlines. Museum collections are being hijacked by political agendas. And the recent battle to acquire the Trump baby blimp is proof." The V&A did not partake in this battle, but it was very much directed at some of the work that the team that I work in do. And this, Maria kindly sent this to me. This is a Portuguese headline, which I am not going to read out. But it's suggestive of the international reach and impact of our collecting activity. So the context in which we work, the museum has 6 collections departments. I sit in the design, architecture and digital team, and we are the newest collections department in the museum. We were founded in 2013 with the museum realizing that design practice is changing and that we have very brilliant and established departments for fashion, textiles and furniture, or ceramics, sculpture, metalwork and glass, but the range of design that was being brought into the museum, into the collection, was not as broad as it might be, that's what I will say. And so we as a team are employed with a commitment to design and society, and our focus has been contemporary from the outset. But as we have grown and matured within the institution, we have been entrusted with the 20th century and thinking broadly about design and society, not just in the here and now, but also into the more recent past, if you think some of our objects are 3,000 years old. And here you can see, last year we hosted an exhibition about the design of video games. We also, as a department, had an exhibition called The Future Starts Here, of which you can see this question, does democracy still work? This is one of the questions asked within that exhibition, and you can see the rapid response pussy hat being used to promote that exhibition, and it was also included. It was a show that looked at 100 projects of design that are shaping our immediate, near, and it's not long term, the word escapes me, the distant future. I think one of the characteristics of our department and what we bring to the V&A is an appreciation that our visitors wake up in the 21st century. We use the familiar to encounter the difficult. So the fact that my visitor or our visitors have a mobile phone in their pocket is a brilliant thing. If I have an object in the case and encourage their imaginations to set flight, to think critically about the world, that is a job well done. I just wanted to try and think about the broader context of what rapid response is trying to do. And it's asking questions from within our own organisation, but within the wider sector, about who has expertise today, who has the tools to find that expertise, and what more can we or should we be doing as those working in museums or perhaps in the broader cultural sector. So this is a book and an outlook that was deeply influential to me. I suppose he's a journalist, Joris Luijendijk, and my Dutch is about as good as my Portuguese, but he was commissioned by The Guardian to write about the financial crash, and his starting point was of zero understanding. And it's a book, to me, which is of an entirely different field, but deeply inspirational. And you cannot read this quote. But he met the editor of the British newspaper The Guardian at a conference in Amsterdam in 2011. And from then on in, he started writing for The Guardian, and this book was the end result. And within it, he writes, so he's talking about himself and the editor, we had talked about why many people seem to have so little interest in the issues that directly affect their interests. Is it indifference and apathy, or have many subjects simply become too complicated for outsiders to understand? It's interesting to think about how some of these questions echo what we've talked about this morning already. And in the book, the author, Luijendijk, goes on to write about a learning curve. It was about asking simple questions, seeking out expertise, and taking readers with him on a journey of discovery. And that taking people with you on a journey is, again, so much of what is embedded within rapid response collecting. Here, the author and the editor of The Guardian are raising questions about journalism, but these are questions which we've already heard today are critical for the work that we all do. What can we do to enable all to engage in a critical debate about design or about culture, about the world around us, and our place within it? How can we open up ourselves and take new and distributed forms of expertise seriously and better enfranchise our publics? So that, again, these are the questions that sit within, they are the challenge of contemporary museum practice, but how do I come to those, and how might we think that we as a sector come to them? So this is another one of our rapid response collecting acquisitions. It's Hello Barbie. So this is an internet-enabled, speech-enabled doll aimed at young children. It has, at the time of launch, 3,000 sentences that it could speak back to your child. Some of them are about career ambitions, some of them are about types of play. Again, what are we allowing technology to do for us? But also, what is that technology doing with our information? This is a listening device in your home. So we live in a digital age, and clearly my interest comes from product and digital design. But we are very much moving from the information age to a lived digital existence. We only need to look at the news to see how social media and the reach of the internet have changed how information is produced and consumed, how knowledge is distributed, how knowledge is understood. And where do we, as professionals, come to that challenge, and what role can the museum play? Museums have an ever greater responsibility to be and act as places of reliable fact, trust, and discourse. I think in the wider context, that is what the museum should do, but it's also a recognition that the museum cannot claim to have a monopoly on that expertise, or indeed that the fact, as once told in the museum, is forever unquestionable. So it's what can we leverage that is within our own control. I'm one curator in a big museum. I work with a team of 5 or 15, depending on how you count. We put 12 objects on display. Admittedly, we do some other things, but it's these 12 objects that push back and ask questions. And it's always a good reminder to me, I'm going to skip this slide, that it's their very modesty that in some ways makes the harder questions more straightforward to ask. Here we've got the 30 objects that we've acquired, 30 plus, and my first motivations of coming to that object, almost acting as a cultural listener. What are these objects telling us about contemporary society? How do I, as a curator, as a listener of society, think about these objects, and how do we surface their value within the museum? Questions like, what's the value of fashion? What's at stake in the digital public sphere? Where do we stand on the climate crisis and the threat to future generations? What does it mean to work in an online warehouse today? Would I want to do it? Those are questions I ask of myself, but they are also questions that the museum puts to our visitors, but also asks our visitors to ask for themselves. And just in conclusion, the more I work on rapid response, the more I realize it's about building relationships of trust. It's about trust within the museum. I have to persuade my director, our head of development, that this is a good thing to do. There are inevitably challenges that come with this type of work within the museum. Extinction Rebellion in London certainly have protested within many of our sister organisations. Am I, in working with them, putting the museum under greater critical focus? Absolutely yes, but we shouldn't be shy of that. We have to build relationships of trust with our public, our visitors, our audience. And I think that's a particular challenge for museums. If we think broadly, it's about being a fact checker if the expertise is not your own. But it's also about saying, I don't want to sound relativist, but I think in the context at the moment of the discourse around decolonialization and the role of our collections and how our collections have been built, we need to build trust with our publics that the work we do in the here and now is reliable, authoritative, and grounded in a broad societal understanding and not from a perspective of past or of privilege. And we also need to build relationships of trust with our designers and manufacturers, those that we work with. Working in the here and now, it's brilliant. Many of these objects are very much available, but those who make them, both in terms of their design or their production, talk back. So you have to engage in those conversations. And this is a large part of the work that we do, but it's also, in many ways, the most special and the most challenging. And I have chosen the boat that says, tell the truth knowingly. And just then to conclude, rapid response is about the radical zeal of museums. It's about acknowledging that museums are changing organizations, and it's about being mindful and open, but still recognizing that the museum is a locus for expertise, but it's not necessarily that that expertise is all from within our walls. And that some of the facts that we hold dear shift and change. When I think about rapid response in the context of the design sector, I consider it, or in the context of all of us, I do see it as something of a call to arms. It's about saying, look at the world around you, think about your choices. It's that informed, critical debate that the museum as a civic and public space should be there to encourage. And it is all done in public, because our public is our best critical friend. So that is where I come to the work that I do. I've raced through, but I hope that that will inspire some conversation and critical discourse.
Bom, a Corinna foi muito mais rápida, por isso se calhar podemos estender aqui um bocadinho o debate, ou não? Podemos estender, podemos. We can start the debate. Anyone can just pose a question or a comment? Yes? We're here.
Não, mas estamos a gravar.
So hi, first and foremost, thank you for coming. I wanted to know, in terms of the V&A, and I think that this is an important thing, and you guys have done it before, how do you coordinate academia, the fact that you're a museum, that you're a fact checker, that you're there to show histories and stories of history, with people that are working, that are doing grassroots work right now. For instance, on the case with the V&A, the interventions by the GALDEM and working with activists, how does that inform your public? And how has that changed your interactions with the public itself?
So you've asked...
a million things, kind of.
I'm going to phrase that as two questions. One, how do we work with activists? And how do we actually make that meaningful to a wide audience?
Yes, and how, on the case, because normally, okay, for me it's not, but people don't see activism and culture working hand in hand. Because activism is reactionary and culture is a thing built. How do you...
There are two, I mean, I get asked a lot whether I'm political in the work that I do, or if I'm an activist curator. I quite like that title. I don't hold that culture and activism go against each other, because that's a particular understanding of culture. Culture is dispersed. There is not one elite authority. There might be in some avenues of the cultural sector, that belief, but it's not one that I hold. So if we come to Extinction Rebellion, working with them is the only way I can get that object into the collection. That object is only interesting if they will work with me. Because if I think of my work as collecting for today, and that discourse today, it's also about collecting for the future. And if I observe my colleagues who work with collections of the past, when they are creating new galleries or exhibitions, they're often looking for objects that have a personal connection or a rounded story which they can frame to bring relevance to the here and now. So it might be a wash bowl from the 18th century that belonged to a woman who earned enough money to buy that bowl or use that bowl for herself. So with Extinction Rebellion, it's about understanding how those activists work, how they've conceived of their design, and the privilege that I have as a museum professional they want to work with me, they want their work in the V&A. How do I make that as broad as possible? So that then becomes public in the documentation that the museum holds. That object is then rich for the future. So my conversations with the Extinction Rebellion Arts Group go on the record. They are in public, and they serve the here and now and the future. Your second question was about how those collaborations are more broadly meaningful. You mentioned Galdem and our collaboration with them. I think that's right. Yes. So Galdem is a London-based, quite young magazine, but deeply influential, created by and for women of colour and all genders. And we worked with them on a programme called Friday Late, which sits in my department. And that is, again, about opening up. It's a programme that has a 20-year history, and it has always been about recognising, as a young practitioner, it's difficult to get your work into the museum, but how can we leverage the cultural platform of the museum to benefit the next generation? And that next generation has often been understood about the designer, so the professions, but actually we need to find spaces and places in the museum for the next generation of critic, the next generation of visitor, different generations as well, and different socio-economic and ethnic outlooks within the museum. And so often our organisations reach to the event-based moment, and with Friday Late, certainly the work that we are now doing is to shift from a 10 times a year event into a durational platform that has 10 moments of public expression. So we're trying to change ourselves from the inside out. We're trying, we're not there. But it's hard work, but it's the most important work that we do.
Good afternoon. Cristiane Silveira from the Natural History Museum here in Lisbon. You spoke about technology, and you have the objects that is the touching part of this technology. But actually there is a dimension that you don't see, that they are the files, the virtual part of the technology. So how can you deal with this dimension when you are trying to raise questions on the public? Respecting example for the gun, you have the object itself, but the file, in the way the file cross, this is the important issue. So how you deal with that, the things that you don't see, but you know that they exist. Thank you.
So digital design, so there is born digital design, which has no material thing, and then the hybrid digital design, like all of the phones in our pockets. That object cannot be understood unless you can experience how it works, and that is an ascendant curve. That difficulty of understanding is ever increasing. So there are two answers to that. Again, one is how do we collect those objects and how do we display them? And in my role as a curator of the digital, it's about fostering new understanding of what it means to catalogue these types of objects, because without sound cataloguing, it doesn't become public information. How do we store? How do we preserve? And how do we make public? So those are kind of collections care questions, and that is part of the everyday challenge. The other way to look at it, and for me, about, in a sense of a curator as a public intellectual, it's about finding those objects that enable you to ask the questions of the intangible, the digital sphere. And the most powerful object that I tried to collect it for Rapid Response Collecting, but it didn't quite work out. And this was a set of broken computer parts that they came into being when The Guardian, the newspaper again, was publishing Edward Snowden's leaked files from the NSA. And they also held information from British intelligence agencies. So the government said, you are holding information that is ours. The Guardian said, that physical computer is mine. Those files were multiple. So there was a entirely theatrical occurrence whereby the intelligence agencies went to the newspaper office and they broke the computers. It was a computer like this, broken. Fortunately for me, The Guardian kept those objects. They didn't know what for, but I said, can we put them in the museum? Because if you see a consumer electronic that has been subject to such force, you understand, because you can see, what's at stake in the digital public realm. Those objects don't come around very often, but it's our job, and to be good at our job, to find those objects that communicate those challenges. Because about design and society today cannot be understood without that digital lived experience. How we make that present and public in our galleries into the future is a challenge that is distributed across the museum, because it's not just our conservation teams, it's also our visitor experience teams who need to keep those galleries working every day, but also our IT departments that are suddenly being entrusted with objects in a way that they haven't been before. I don't have the answers, but
Congratulations for your work. I would like to know a bit more. You have mentioned already, I think, 2 or 3 examples of how you are collecting, hearing other people's suggestions. And it would be, I would like to know a bit more about that process, you know, how you open that consultancy, if it's something that you have thought since the beginning when you acquired this position, when you came to this position, or if it's an ongoing process that you start to understand how you can make it more collaborative. And then when you, I don't know if you have to propose the, like the acquisition of the objects to someone above you, if this negotiation, is it something that is difficult, or if the person above you is open to other people's suggestions, how this process of collecting goes?
So the idea of rapid response collecting being in public in the broader sense has been an ambition since we started, but we needed to get going before people could know, and that's my immediate colleagues, those in the sector, but also those who come to the museum, that it is a platform for the suggestion of objects. And so first the objects came largely from within the team. Then, as the momentum grew from others in the museum and other curatorial peers, then it was journalists, because the journalists are writing about it. And it takes time. It takes time. So the pussy hat, that was suggested by people within the museum and beyond. And for me, proof of concept, we're going somewhere. And then again, with Extinction Rebellion, the number of people who suggested that beyond my own interest was considerable. So again, it's a cumulative thing, but the thing that's challenging there is they are both objects of mass discontent, but also of protest. And so those are already activist communities who understand perhaps that being in public is very important. The objects that are material innovation, these objects that change how you and I live together. One of them that we have in the collection is a new lift hoisting material developed by the Finnish company Koni. It means that a lift can go 500 meters within a single run, which is transformative to our urban landscape and also the height at which buildings will be built. Those types of objects are almost harder to find, but they are equally important. In terms of process within the museum, when we first developed the idea of this collecting activity, we were quite new as a department, and we had to go through various committees to suggest the idea, to get it approved. And one of the questions that was consistently put to us was, well, why don't you keep the objects for 5 years and then make a decision about whether they should come into the permanent collection, which is a fair question, but my response and reaction is 5 years is the perspective of history, but also museums are extremely cautious of iterative processes or the idea of failure. But failure, just like taste, is a very relative concept. Or it is, I don't want to be relativist, but these things change. And you have to be rigorous, but also, I suppose, in some ways, slightly courageous in the work that you do. I mean, anybody who acquires an object is having to make a balanced decision with limited resources and the application of knowledge, whether it's connoisseurship of a more traditional kind or not. So every object has to go through the same process as a 17th century piece of inlaid ivory furniture. How it works at the V&A is we have a fund for collecting objects, which we have to bid for. So sometimes we have to make a case. But when the objects are modest or inexpensive, that barrier to entry in some way isn't there. So perhaps the traditional or conventional and the very important, so don't misunderstand, structures of collecting, we have to comply with those, but they don't create the pinch points that it might do for other forms of acquisition. But what we absolutely do, and it's really important, is we let the maker, the designer, the manufacturer know that we are acquiring that object, because it comes back to that relationship of trust. Who is it that we are working with? And when the objects are perhaps more newsworthy or challenging in other ways, I absolutely brief our executive board and our director to make sure that they are aware of the activity, but that it is also an independent curatorial programme. And so far, we are in happy marriage.
Any more questions or comments?
Hi, Corinna. I have actually two questions, but I'll try to be very brief. One regards aesthetics and maybe even what Walter Benjamin talked about, the idea of aura. The idea of aura in an object and how, you know, the age of art in the reproduction age is, what I love the fact about rapid response collecting is that it collects objects of design which are by definition replicas, copies of a design. And by doing that, you guys are in a way kind of challenging two things in my reading. The idea of aura and now of an object, so because almost all the objects you have selected are not that precious or that not unique, maybe with the exception of the Guardian broken computer and maybe the 3D printed gun. And also the idea of aesthetics, because one of the expectations with museums of art and applied art and also of design have been placed, the collection of objects have placed aesthetics in a high place. And you guys, in a sense, are kind of eschewing aesthetics and replacing aesthetics with politics. That's I'd like to hear a comment on that regarding the context of this conference, of how are you kind of really putting politics first than aesthetics in an applied arts museum? And the second question is, have other museums, design or art or applied art museums around the world not copied, but been inspired by rapid response collecting? Thanks.
Thank you for both of those questions. This question of the ever reproducible object, it's a long-held discourse and debate, but I would ask us all to think about value and what we consider to be precious. And if we're thinking about design and society or design and politics, what is more precious, the material from which an object is made, or the stories and context, the sociability of that object? I work in a museum where I have very many colleagues who are invested in the aesthetic of an object, the beauty, the craft, the design in a more expected sense. Rapid response is one activity of many, which in some ways seeks to be broad and expanded in its definition of design. It's not exclusive, it's inclusive. And when that very precious object comes, that enables us to ask the questions of today, absolutely it's in. It's not to say I'm not interested, but actually, if you look at the design museum sector as a whole, I would wager the argument there are very many people far too interested in beauty, and you and I, when we go to those museums, cannot find ourselves. Museums are public organisations for a public that is broad. In some ways, this small activity is an important addition to that other form of curatorial practice, scholarship, expertise. The aura of the object. So we have a Kickstarter drone in the collection. It's tiny, it's never flown, it's Kickstarter's greatest failure. That object becomes precious to me because I have had the opportunity to kind of capture, not just for me, but for the public, or for the history, for posterity, the narrative that this guy is a little bit hooked. So the person who finally got one of these malfunctioning drones, he is hooked on Kickstarter. A Kickstarter influencer. What is this in our world? What does Kickstarter mean for the product that you and I consume? The middle person that tests, improves, iterates is gone. It's direct from maker to consumer. It's changing the world of and how we consume things. But the thing that really makes it special is the museum paid him for that object. And he says, my wife will be really happy. She can now buy a washing machine. It's much more important to our daily lives. That washing machine anecdote is what will make that object precious. It gives it its aura for the future. So I think it's about how you understand value, how that object can inform, or how that understanding of design can inform the more aesthetically pleasing or the more conventionally valuable. The other, I'm not always sure that where I stand on this analogy, but if you look at contemporary art practice, there is an argument made by Boris Groys that content and context is the new medium for contemporary practice. Artists, curators, museums, we don't operate in a vacuum, and in some ways, the design or the social aspect of design in this particular activity is as important. And social equals political. To me, you can't disassociate the two. And if we are invested in social society, conditions, human conditions, all of those different phrases, the political is inevitably there. But so is the beautiful. I mean, Echo this morning, sentimentality, emotion, all of that plays in. Why do we like the iPhone more than any other phone? Because it's beautiful. Those questions don't disassociate for me. Your second question was about rapid response and its broader impact. I think if you look in the press, there is an idea that rapid response collecting is now a thing. You see it in the international press quite freely used, which suggests impact. I think it often describes a reactive mode of acquisition. And the more that we do this, the better. So that to me is good news. In terms of more specifically how we operate with design and contemporary practice and that discourse, like I am here today, it's almost, the interest is considerable. And it's not so much as how do we do the same, but how can we leverage what we have within our control to make change, or how can we think about the contemporary to inform the recent or the distant past, or our future choices. And that's where rapid response has piqued interest in the international museum sector.
Well, I think we don't have time for more questions or comments. Thank you, Corinna. Thank you for the audience that was very participative. I think we have a diversity of questions and comments. It was very rich. Thank you for sharing your rapid experience. Now we are going to be in another setting, yes, a long table with comments. and it's going to be orientated by Paulo Varanda. I think it's better for Maria to explain how it's going to work. Yeah, Paulo will do it.
Vamos dar 5 minutos só para rearranjar e para acrescentar um microfone na mesa. Portanto, se quiserem levantar um bocadinho. Thank you, Corinna.